Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Try Not to Sleep. I'm your host, Ethan Brooks. And as always, we're here with another calm, slightly boring story from history to help you unwind. Tonight, we're diving into the ancient puzzle of who actually created Anunnaki and whether anyone or anything could be called the true God behind it all. All right, get comfortable, and let's see how far you make it before you fall asleep. Let's start with something that seems simple, but isn't. When people talk about gods, especially ancient ones, there is this habit of thinking in straight lines. Good versus evil, creator versus created, one God at the top, everything else below. But ancient people didn't see it that way. Their gods weren't just rulers or saviors. They were unpredictable, sometimes nurturing, sometimes terrifying, forces of both creation and destruction at once. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Anunnaki, those famous figures from Sumerian myth, weren't thought of as the ultimate creators. In fact, the question of who or what created them is left open, hanging over the whole story. It's a gap modern minds often skip past. But to the Sumerians, divine beings didn't just pop out of nowhere. They descended, carrying with them a sense of origin that was cosmic, not just symbolic. The ancient texts even marked this with a sign, a prefix, Dingir, placed before the names of gods. It wasn't just a mark of respect. It meant these beings came from the heavens, that their roots were not of this world. And it wasn't about a single god ruling everything. There was a whole lineage, a genealogy of divinity, connecting the gods to the stars and to each other. So when we ask, who is the God you've been worshiping? Is it really the source, or just one more figure in a long, tangled line? The answer, for the ancients, wasn't simple. Their world was layered, full of conversations between heavens, not a single voice echoing in a void. And that's the mystery that still lingers. The creator of the Anunnaki remains unknown, and the true nature of divinity is more complex than any single name can hold. Now, to understand the Anunnaki, we have to step into the world of the ancient Near East, a place where gods weren't just ideas, but members of a vast cosmic family. The Canaanites, for example, had a full caste: El, Asherah, Baal, Mot, each governing their own part of the universe. This was the environment where Yahweh, later so central, started out as just one among many. But when we look at Sumer and Mesopotamia, the picture sharpens. Here, the Anunnaki weren't the creators of existence. They were more like heirs, successors in a cosmic dynasty, tasked with keeping the celestial order run. Think of them as administrators, not architects. Their power was real, but it was handed down, not absolute. At the top of this order sat Anu, called an Akkadian. He wasn't just another god. He was the sky itself, the supreme authority in the heavens. But even Anu didn't create the universe from nothing. His authority was inherited, not invented. He ruled, but he didn't originate. The way people marked this divine status was strikingly visual. In Sumer, the 8-pointed star, the Dingir, was stamped before the names of gods like Inanna, Enlil, and Enki. This wasn't just decoration. It meant these beings came from the sky, from somewhere beyond. Every god got this star, suggesting that divinity was a shared phenomenon, not a single monopoly. So, what does all this mean? The ancients saw their gods not as isolated rulers, but as members of a lineage, each with a job, a symbol, and a place in the cosmic order. Their heavens were crowded, and their theology was written in the language of inheritance and celestial sign. Hold that image, a sky full of names, each marked by a star, each carrying a piece of inherited authority. The next question is, how did these symbols and genealogies shape the way people understood power, both divine and earthly? If you look at the way ancient societies built their worlds, you'll notice something. Their gods weren't just a random collection of names. Instead, they were arranged in councils, families, and courts, a cosmic bureaucracy that mirrored the world on the ground. The Sumerians had their court of Anu, Enlil, and Enki. The Greeks, their Olympian council. The Vedic tradition, a sky father among a cluster of divine siblings. This pattern wasn't unique to one place. It was everywhere. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about storytelling. The gods had lineages, power passed down, split, or was shared. Authority wasn't absolute. It was inherited, negotiated, and sometimes even contested. Just like kings and chiefs on earth, the gods were part of dynasties. Their relationships, parent, child, rival, mapped directly onto the way people understood order, inheritance, and leadership in their own societies. And polytheism? Easy to imagine it as chaos, a jumble of conflicting gods and rituals. But the evidence points the other way. Every city had its patron deity, every craft or natural force, its own divine overseer. This was a system. Diversity wasn't disorder. It was a way to keep life's complexity organized, with each god handling their own portfolio. The result was a living map of the world, where the heavens reflected the structure of human life below. So, when we see these divine councils and hierarchies, we're not just peering into mythology. We're seeing the ancient blueprint for how people made sense of power, loyalty, and community on Earth and in the sky. Here's something that doesn't get much attention outside specialist circles. The very words we use for God weren't always about a single all-powerful being. If you trace the roots, the Akkadian word Elohim meant divinity in a broad sense. More like the gods than the god. Over time, Elohim flows into the Hebrew language as El and Elohim. But here's the twist. Elohim is actually a plural word. It originally referred to a whole group of divine beings, not a lone ruler. So, how did a word for many become the name for just one? It wasn't a simple shift. Ancient religions started with a crowd of gods, each with their own territory, family, and Job. El and Yahweh, names that later became almost synonymous with the idea of one supreme deity, were once just two among many. They were part of a divine council, plural by nature, tied to real places and people. But the story doesn't stop at language. The shift from many gods to one wasn't automatic or inevitable. There were stages in between: henotheism and monolatry. In henotheism, people picked one god to focus on, but didn't deny the others existed. Monolatry sharpened that focus. Worship one, but quietly acknowledge the rest are still out there. Early Israelites, for example, probably practiced monolatry, treating Yahweh as their champion, but not erasing the competition. Only later did this hierarchy collapse into true monotheism, where all the complexity and plurality got flattened into a single, all-encompassing God. The divine became more abstract, more distant, and, at least in theory, more powerful. This wasn't just a theological upgrade. It was a transformation of how people saw the world, their place in it, and even the words they spoke when they looked up at the sky. Yahweh's story doesn't start at the top. In the earliest traces, he's not the singular ruler of the cosmos. Hashi's a local god, tied to wild places and borderlands. The evidence points to Yahweh as a storm or warrior deity, linked to harsh territories like Edom and Midian. He wasn't even known to the earliest patriarchs. Instead, he enters the scene later, likely through contact with Midianite tribes. In those early days, Yahweh's power was about thunder, battle, and the unpredictable forces outside the settled world. But something shifts as the tribes of Israel begin to unite. When Saul, David, and Solomon rise as kings, Yahweh's role expands. He's no longer just a protector of a wandering people. He's recast as the national God of a unified Israel. Yet, the old texts don't hide the transition. In songs and poems, like the Song of Deborah, Yahweh still appears as just one God among several. The move from tribal champion to national symbol isn't instant. It's a slow layering of myth and politics. Here's where things get even more interesting. Yahweh doesn't just grow in stature. He absorbs. Traits from other gods are stitched into his identity. El, the old fatherly creator, lends Yahweh authority and creative power. Baal, a rival storm god, passes on control over the weather and fertility. And then there's Asherah. Inscriptions from sites like Kuntale Arud mention Yahweh and his Asherah, hinting that Yahweh once had a divine consort, a memory later erased from official doctrine. This blending isn't just spiritual, it's political. Howsoever well, after the northern kingdom of Israel collapses, leaders in Judah need to rally their people. Syncretism, merging Yahweh with the powers and stories of other gods, becomes a tool for unification. It's not just about belief. It's about survival and centralizing control. The God who started in the wilderness is now the cornerstone of a nation. So, the Yahweh we meet in later texts isn't a static figure. He's the product of centuries of negotiation between tribes, kings, and competing visions of the divine. And behind every change, there's a trace of political calculation woven into the very fabric of faith. There's a moment in the story where everything shifts. Not just the theology, but the rules of everyday life. Who you could worship, where, and how. That moment comes with King Josiah. Before Josiah, the land was dotted with shrines and altars, each one tied to a different tradition or local god. But Josiah's reforms weren't just about tidying up the religious landscape. They were a campaign, systematic, forceful, and total. He ordered the destruction of every competing shrine. Anything that hinted at an older plural tradition was torn down or erased. But it didn't stop at breaking altars. Josiah's circle went deeper, rewriting the very texts that defined the people's relationship with the divine. Old stories were revised, laws were tightened, and the message was sharpened. There is only one God for Israel, and his name is Yahweh. This wasn't just a spiritual decision. It was a political one, meant to unify a fractured people under a single banner. The impact was immediate and lasting. The idea of Yahweh as the only true God became law, not just belief. Competing voices and memories of the old pantheon were officially silenced. Even after disaster struck and the people were exiled to Babylon, the reforms held. When they returned, the old diversity was gone. What came back was something new. One God, transcendent and unchallenged, at the center of a national identity. It's a decisive change, a before and after moment for the entire tradition. Let's look closer at the text itself, not just the stories, but how those stories were built. The Hebrew Bible isn't a single, seamless work. It's a patchwork stitched together from different sources: Yahwist, Elohist, Deuteronomist, priestly. Each one had its own agenda, its own way of seeing the world, and its own reasons for telling the story the way it did. This means what we call the Bible is more like a record of debates and negotiations than a unified message from beyond. Sometimes the differences are subtle: a shift in the name for God, a change in tone, a new law or ritual. Other times, the seams show through. Contradictions, doubled stories, or sudden switches in perspective. These aren't accidents. They're the fingerprints of competing interests and shifting power. Now, here's where things get tricky. Modern readers often smooth over these cracks. We tend to read the text as if it's all coming from a single voice, with a single, all-powerful God. But in the original language, you'll find clues that something else is going on. Take Elohim. It's a plural word, yet most translations flatten it into God and move on. Even in Genesis, the phrase, "Let us make man in our image," hints at a conversation, a council, not a lone figure issuing commands. The risk? When we impose our own expectations, especially the modern drive for singular, clear-cut answers, we lose the original complexity. We miss the chorus of voices, the tension, and the unresolved questions that made these stories powerful in the first place. And there's another layer. Later scriptures didn't just inherit old motifs. They recycled them, polished them, and sometimes rebranded them for new political realities. What looks like divine revelation can, at times, be a carefully crafted tool for unifying a people, legitimizing a regime, or pushing a new agenda. Not every echo from the past is there by accident. So, when we read these ancient texts, we're not just reading about the past. We're seeing the machinery of power, belief, and memory at work, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. The next step is to ask, what do we risk losing when we read these stories only through the lens of our own time? When we look at creation stories from around the world, it's tempting to see them as ancient news reports, straight accounts of how everything began. But here's the thing. These myths weren't meant as literal history. They're closer to poetry than to science, shaped by people's longing to make sense of where they came from. The details might sound fantastic, but the impulse behind them is deeply human. If you strip away the names and the settings, something interesting appears. No matter where you look, Babylon, Egypt, India, Greece, or ancient Israel, there's a familiar rhythm underneath. It starts with chaos or emptiness, then a divine act, sometimes a word, sometimes a battle, sometimes a spark, and finally, the world as we know it. Order, structure, light. It's a pattern that repeats, even when the surface details change. But the real twist is how each culture fills in those steps. For the Babylonians, creation is harsh, born from violence and struggle. In Egypt, it's a gentle rising, the world emerging from an endless sea in cycles. Hindu stories stretch time into infinity, with the universe breathing in and out forever. The Greeks tell of family drama and cosmic succession, while the Hebrew tradition focuses on order, law, and a moral framework. So creation myths aren't just stories about the beginning. They're mirrors, reflecting what each people valued, feared, or hoped for. When we read them this way, we're not just learning about the past. We're seeing the world through ancient eyes, one culture at a time. Picture the very beginning, not with gods or thrones, but with water. Not a gentle stream or a rain cloud, but an endless, silent ocean. That's the backdrop ancient cultures imagined for the birth of everything. It's not just poetic. It's the stage on which their origin stories unfold. The cosmic ocean wasn't a place you could visit. It was the mystery before anything else had a name. But why water? Here's where geography quietly shapes belief. Early civilizations grew up along rivers, the Nile, the Tigris, where life itself seemed to rise from the mud after floods. To them, water wasn't just a resource. It was the source. Creation, they noticed, always came from the wet, fertile places. So when they pictured the start of the world, they saw a boundless sea, holding the potential for everything that could ever be. This idea wasn't limited to storytellers or priests. Even the earliest philosophers got swept up in it. Thales of Miletus, one of the first to ask what everything is made of, said, "All is water." He wasn't talking about rivers or rain. He meant something deeper. Water as the arch, the boundless essence behind earth, sky, even the soul. For Thales, the primordial waters were the divine womb, the invisible sea from which all forms and time itself emerged. So, in these ancient minds, water wasn't just a symbol. It was the original canvas, silent, infinite, and sacred. And for a moment, you can almost feel the awe they must have felt, standing at the edge of their world, staring out into an ocean that was both real and utterly mysterious. Let's look at how these origin stories actually unfold, because here's where the differences really stand out. In Babylonian myth, creation isn't gentle or orderly. It's a fight. The world begins with Tiamat and Apsu, salt and fresh water, mingling, then birthing the first gods. But almost immediately, there's chaos. Marduk, the champion god, has to defeat Tiamat in a violent battle. He uses her body to shape the universe. So, in this telling, existence is born from conflict and destruction. Order comes out of violence, not out of peace. But if you shift to Egypt, the mood changes completely. Creation there starts with none, the endless, formless ocean. Out of this quiet depth rises the Benben mound, and from it, Atum appears, self-created, sovereign. The Egyptian gods don't battle for supremacy. They emerge, one after another, in a kind of cosmic family tree. Everything unfolds in cycles and balance, not war. The world isn't conquered. It's coaxed into being. Hindu cosmology goes even further in a different direction. Creation isn't a one-time event or a struggle at all. Instead, it's a pulse, an endless rhythm. Brahman, the formless absolute, underlies everything. The trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva keep the universe cycling through birth, preservation, and destruction. Time here isn't a straight line. It's a wheel, turning forever, with no true beginning or end. Greek myth, though, brings the focus back to drama. Hesiod describes a void, chaos, then Gaia, Tartarus, and Eros. From there, generations of gods rise, fight, form alliances, and topple each other. It's a story of power struggles, betrayals, and shifting hierarchies. The divine world is a family, but a turbulent one. So, each culture paints creation in its own colors, sometimes violent, sometimes harmonious, sometimes eternal and cyclical, sometimes tangled in rivalry. These aren't just different stories. They're different answers to the same ancient question. What does it mean to begin? Let's shift focus for a moment, from the broad strokes of creation myths to a single ancient text that quietly shaped the stories that came after it. The Enuma Elish stands out, not just for its age, but for the way it imagines the beginning. Instead of a universe conjured from nothing, it tells of a world built through descent. Gods don't appear out of thin air. They emerge from a long chain of cosmic ancestors. Anu, the sky god, isn't the first. He's the heir. Before him, Anshar and Kisha, and before them, the primordial waters of Tiamat and Apsu. Each generation inherits and transforms what came before. This isn't just a detail. It's a whole different way of thinking about origins. In the Enuma Elish, power and existence are passed down, not invented. Creation is a family affair, tangled and layered, with new gods rising from the old. There's no single, all-powerful being at the start, just a lineage stretching back into the unknown. Here's the part that's easy to miss. The Enuma Elish was already ancient by the time the earliest biblical stories were told. Its tales of cosmic succession, struggle, and inheritance were written down thousands of years before Moses or Genesis. Yet, echoes of these older patterns show up in later scriptures, sometimes almost hidden, sometimes right on the surface. So, when we talk about the roots of creation stories, we're not just looking at what each culture believed. We're seeing how the deepest myths were handed down, reworked, and remembered, long before they ever reached the page. Genesis stands apart from the older myths we've seen, but not because it's a total break. Here, creation happens in 6 measured days. No battles, no divine family tree, just a single God speaking, and the world takes shape. Light is called out of darkness. Waters are split. Land, sky, and life appear one after the other, all by command. But here's the twist. While Genesis feels new, scholars argue it's actually part of a much older conversation. The story borrows the language of chaos and order, echoes the motif of light emerging from darkness, and even keeps the rhythm of cosmic days. The difference is in the framing. Instead of a council of gods, or a drama of cosmic violence, everything is streamlined into one voice, one will, one creator. This isn't just a matter of style. It's a conscious reshaping. According to many researchers, Genesis doesn't erase the past. It absorbs and transforms it. The ancient symbols, the deep, the darkness, the separation of waters, are still there, but now they serve a new idea. a single sovereign God with no rivals, no lineage, no need for structure. So, Genesis isn't an island. It's more like a bridge, carrying forward fragments of older stories, but recasting them in a new light. The result is a creation story that feels both familiar and radically different, standing at the crossroads of memory and reinvention. Let's pull back the curtain on a contradiction that rarely gets discussed outside of specialist circles. In most traditions, the Creator God is the highest power, the one who brings everything into being. But in Gnostic cosmology, this isn't the case. Here, the central figure shaping the material world is called the Demiurge, a craftsman, not the ultimate source. The Gnostics gave the Demiurge names like Yaldabaoth, Saklas, or Samael. These aren't titles of honor. They mean things like fool, blind god, arrogant designer. The message: this being thinks he's the only God. He even says, I am God, and there is no other beside me. But he's mistaken. Gnostics saw this as hubris, not truth. This is where things get really provocative. Gnostic texts identify the Demiurge with Yahweh, the God of Genesis. Instead of viewing Yahweh as the benevolent creator, they saw him as an ignorant ruler, one who shapes matter but doesn't understand the spirit behind it. In their view, the Demiurge isn't evil in the cartoonish sense, but he's blind to the higher reality. He tries to imitate perfection, but can only produce a flawed copy. That's a sharp break from mainstream monotheism. The Gnostic Demiurge is powerful, yes, but he's not the ultimate source. He's a craftsman working with borrowed materials, unaware of the deeper, hidden light behind existence. This idea unsettles the simple hierarchy we've seen so far. It opens up a new layer of questioning. Who or what really stands behind the universe we know? Let's step away from mythic thrones and cosmic battles for a moment. Here's a shift. Some of the world's oldest philosophies don't picture creation as a contest or a family drama. Instead, they look for something deeper, something that doesn't move, doesn't act, but simply is. Aristotle called it the unmoved mover, not a god with a name or a face, but a perfect, timeless source. This mover starts the chain of motion in the universe, but nothing causes it. It's the quiet root beneath every ripple. The idea isn't about a creator building the world out of nothing, but about a pure source, so complete it doesn't even need to act. But Aristotle wasn't alone in thinking there's more behind the curtain. Across different traditions, you find hints of a deeper reality that makes creator gods themselves look like shadows on the wall. Hinduism calls it Brahman, unbounded consciousness, beyond all forms, described as truth, consciousness, bliss. The Hermetic tradition speaks of the all, a sustaining presence in every moment. Spinoza, centuries later, would call this God nature itself, not a ruler, but the living substance of everything. And here's the pattern. In Gnostic, Hermetic, Hindu, and even Spinozan thought, creation isn't a one-time event. It's not a command or a battle. It's an eternal emanation, something that flows endlessly from the One or the Source, without beginning or end. So, when you peel back the layers, you find something both unsettling and peaceful. The world, in these philosophies, isn't built by a king or a craftsman. It's the ongoing expression of a silent, boundless presence, one that never really started and never truly ends. Up to now, we've seen how ancient stories describe creation as a process. Sometimes a struggle, sometimes a rhythm. But there's another layer, quieter and more symbolic, that runs beneath those myths. Instead of a single god or a cosmic battle, some traditions speak of archetypes rising from the primordial waters. The mother and the father. These aren't just characters in a story. They're symbols, expressions of breath and fire, pulse and pattern. They point to cosmic truths, not personalities with thrones or tempers. In this view, the primordial mother and father aren't separate from the source. They're distinct facets within the one. Two sides of a single underlying reality. Their union isn't about genealogy or hierarchy. It's about the way existence expresses itself in dualities. Breath and fire, silence and movement. Each is necessary, and neither stands alone. Then comes something new. From the interplay of mother and father, a third principle emerges. This is the Son, not in the sense of a child, but as a living bridge. Traditions call this the Logos, the Word, or the flame in motion. It's the moment when the one becomes three, not as a split, but as a dynamic unfolding. Creation in these teachings isn't a one-off event. It's an eternal emanation, a flow that never stops. Hermetic and Gnostic sources describe this as a triad: mind, word, and matter. The Father emits forms, the Son conveys them, and matter receives. It's a pattern, not a pecking order. The story shifts from power to presence, from command to emergence. This Trinity isn't about division, but about how unity expresses itself in the world. It's a quiet, ongoing movement, one that keeps unfolding even now. There's a shift in perspective that doesn't get much airtime, one that quietly flips the script on how we picture creation itself. Instead of a cosmic command or decree, some traditions describe creation as something softer. Not an order given, but presence shared. It's more like a dance than a law. This view suggests creation isn't about a distant authority shaping the world through sheer will. Instead, it's about connection, an ongoing transmission, almost like a current of love that moves through everything. The universe, in this light, isn't built out of obedience or fear. It's sustained by relationship, by a kind of cosmic intimacy. Think about what that means for the old images of gods as kings or judges. If creation is a dance of presence, then the divine isn't standing above, demanding loyalty. The divine is here, moving with us, inviting us to join in. It's not about being ruled over, but about being included. That's a quiet but radical reframe. The world isn't a product of commands, but of an endless invitation, an act of sharing, not control. Creation, then, becomes less about power and more about participation, less about hierarchy, more about belonging. This changes the tone of the story. Instead of fear or duty, the foundation is love, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Here's where the story takes a sharper turn. Religion, for all its talk of transcendence, has often been tangled up with power. Not just spiritual guidance, but real earthly control. Kings and rulers, from Hammurabi to the pharaohs, claimed their right to rule by divine authority. Their laws weren't just rules. They were stamped with the will of the gods. The message was clear: obey the king, or risk the wrath of heaven. This wasn't just about the rulers themselves. Priests and prophets positioned themselves as the exclusive mediators, the only ones with access to the divine. If you disobeyed them, you weren't just breaking a rule. You were breaking faith with the universe itself. Over time, this idea hardened into the divine right of kings, a system where loyalty became a sacred duty. Dissent wasn't just political, it was heresy. But there's a darker side to this alignment of heaven and throne. When a god is painted as jealous, tribal, or always at war, that image spills over into human affairs. History is full of crusades, inquisitions, and sectarian violence, all justified by the belief that one group alone holds the favor of the divine. The line between spiritual path and tool of control gets blurry, sometimes vanishing altogether. And here's a thought worth holding on to. If a religion draws its strength from dividing people, by declaring some saved and others damned, maybe that's not true religion at all. Maybe it's just another mask for power. Let's step quietly into unfamiliar territory. Up to now, gods have had names, faces, and stories, each one tangled in myth, power, or cosmic drama. But here's the thing. What if the real presence behind it all doesn't fit any of those shapes? Some sources describe the true God as something you can't point to or picture. Not a king on a throne. Not a voice booming commands. Not a figure at the top of a cosmic ladder. Instead, it's the silence beneath all sound. The light that's there before we even open our eyes. Formless, omnipresent, not asking for worship, obedience, or belief. Just quietly present. And this changes everything. If God is not a being with needs or demands, then all the rituals, monuments, and even the names we've built might be beside the point. The story suggests the only thing this source asks is that we remember our unity, our original connection, the fact that we were never truly separate. Here's a detail that often gets missed. The divine mystery isn't locked in temples or books. It lives in the center of consciousness, in the quiet moments, those flashes of clarity, awe, or even grief. The true God never spoke, never issued decrees, but simply is. The invitation isn't to search outward, but to notice that presence within, to realize the experience of the divine is always personal, always now. In this view, being itself is the answer. Nothing to chase, nothing to prove, just a return to what was never lost. For most of the story so far, divinity has been distant. Kings in the sky, cosmic rulers, names heavy with authority. But when we look at the earliest records of Jesus, something quietly different happens. He doesn't address God with the old, formal title. Instead, he uses Abba, a word closer to Dad than Almighty. It's not just a linguistic quirk. In a moment of fear and surrender, Jesus says, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. The tone is raw, personal, almost childlike. This isn't the language of a subject before a king. It's the language of someone reaching for comfort, not just power. That shift matters. It signals a new way of relating to the divine, not as a distant judge, but as something close, familiar, and safe. For some, this is the heart of the story, the message, not the institution. That's why, for many, the words and actions of figures like Jesus or Buddha hold more weight than the religions built around them. The teachings are what matter, not the layers of ritual, hierarchy, or dogma that came later. But there's another layer that often gets left out of mainstream conversations. In Gnostic texts, Jesus isn't just a teacher or a savior. He's a guide, someone who sees through the illusions of the world and points the way back to a hidden, ultimate source. Not everyone accepts this picture, of course, but for those drawn to it, the meaning of Jesus isn't about founding a new religion. It's about waking up, seeing past appearances, and returning to what's real. So, within the same name, you find two radically different paths. One of faith and belonging, the other of awakening and direct experience. Both trace back to the same voice, Abba. But the journey they offer couldn't feel more different. There's a point in the story where the search for meaning slips out of the hands of gods and creation myths altogether. Instead of climbing higher toward a throne in the sky, the journey turns inward and downward into a kind of quiet mystery that existed before any name, any story, any cosmic battle. It's not about escaping the world or abandoning the old tales, but about remembering something that's always been here, a sense of unity with whatever lies beneath it all. This is where things get subtle. The path doesn't end with a final answer or a dramatic revelation. Instead, it circles back, almost like waking up from a long dream and realizing you've never really left home. The idea is that true spirituality isn't about collecting new beliefs or chasing after hidden secrets. It's about rediscovering a connection that was never actually broken. Here, words like creed, worship, or doctrine start to lose their grip. What matters is communion, being present, aware, free, and open to love. Not the kind of love that divides or demands, but the kind that simply is. The journey in this telling is not a ladder to climb, but a return to what's underneath all the ladders. And when you reach what feels like the end, there's no grand unveiling, just a new kind of beginning. Awareness deepens. Oh, the sense of being part of something whole quietly returns. In this view, the mystery isn't solved. It's remembered. Picture this. Before anything began, before gods, before stories, there's only a hush. Not emptiness, not darkness, just a stillness so complete it's almost impossible to imagine. Ancient thinkers tried to point to this moment, calling it the silence before the first sound, the pause before the first ripple. It isn't a gap waiting to be filled, but a presence in itself. No name, no shape, no demand, just being. This idea isn't about another god on a throne or a cosmic architect sketching blueprints. It's something that slips through every symbol and story we've seen so far. The silence before creation isn't just a blank page. It's the page, the ink, and the writer all at once. That's why so many traditions end up circling back to it, even after all the drama of gods and battles and cosmic council. And here's where the story takes its last, quiet turn. We've followed the trail from named gods like Anu, through dynasties and councils and cosmic wars. But if Anu himself is not the source, if even the highest gods are part of a lineage, inheriting their power, then what stands behind them? What or who is the true origin of the Anunnaki, of the cosmos itself? That's the mystery that lingers. The answer isn't written down. It lives in that haunting, eternal silence, before the first sound, before the first word. And maybe that's where the real story begins.